Hi, and welcome back. Today I want to talk about subjectivity. Um, and specifically, I want to talk about it in reference to social sciences, which is what I do. Now, what do social scientists study? Well, for the most part, we study people's behaviors, interactions, their social structures, symbolism. We study those things through religious beliefs, through political organizations. We study them through social stratification, whether it be sort of patriarchal or matriarchal structures. We study it through kinship structures, which is the interrelation of different peoples within a society. And that is a very difficult thing to formalize within the social sciences, and the reason is quite simple. It's because, in the physical sciences we tend to study objects, not subjects. Now, what's the difference between an object and a subject? Well, barring people who have a panpsychic bent, panpsychism is basically the idea that matter has some unit of consciousness in it. But putting that aside, the difference is simply that subjects behave due to internal states. And so, for example, if I feel pain, whether it be emotional pain or physical pain, I take the necessary steps to reduce that pain. Put your hand on a stove, it starts to burn you, pull your hand away. You can put a rock on a stove for thousands of years on a hot plate. It's not going to move because, as far as we can tell, there's no internal state there. Why does this make the social scientific project so difficult? Well, it's because number one, it's very difficult to access internal states, if even possible. We don't even really know what thoughts are from a scientific perspective. I mean, you could try and reduce it to neural firings, and clearly the brain has something to do with behavior. Otherwise, damage to certain regions of the brain wouldn't have corresponding cognitive and behavioral consequences in certain circumstances. But regardless, there are aspects of sensation, for example. There are aspects of feeling, of your internal map of who you are and what the world is, that can't be reduced to mere neural firings. And that's what separates objects from subjects. If you're a physicist and you're looking at matter, space, time, and energy, those things, as far as we can tell, stand on their own 2 feet. I mean, if you pardon the metaphor, there are no feet there. And that's very interesting, because what that means is, if you're trying to design a research protocol, a scientific research protocol, your research subjects aren't going to behave in purely deterministic ways. Now, you can see patterns of behavior. For example, there's lots of game theoretic literature that looks at altruism, cooperation, for example, cooperation and even conflict. And you get things like the prisoner's dilemma, where on average people behave in a particular way when they're trying to maximize a desired outcome within the confines of a social game. Social games seem simply being something like turn taking, where you have a strategy to maximize what you're trying to achieve, and I have a strategy to maximize what I'm trying to achieve. Sometimes those two things are in conflict, and we try to resolve that through really any means. It could be discussion, it could be war, it could be manipulation, it could be really any means of communication to try and get the upper hand. Now, those things aren't super easy to operationalize themselves, because there's certain prior conditions that are sometimes outside of what can be observed and studied, depending on how much time you've got to study the phenomena you're looking at. For example, in a game theoretic setting, people who have a sort of familial relationship are going to behave differently to strangers, generally speaking. And so there are priors there that you kind of have to take into account. If you're just looking at how an atom behaves under certain conditions, it's gonna, if it's the same roughly the same thing that you're looking at. If you're looking at hydrogen atoms or helium atoms, they're going to behave in a particular way that's relatively consistent, and that's why it's so easy to formalize physics and chemistry as sciences, or geology. Um, but once you start getting into like the living systems, once you start getting specifically to conscious systems, whether it be animals or people, the rule book goes, you kind of have to throw that away. And that's at the heart of what we're trying to do as social scientists, is we're trying to formalize the study of subjects, because I do think it's possible. Now, I think it's possible for a whole host of reasons that I'm going to discuss at some other point, but I do think that it's possible. Because I do think that there are certain, for example, intersubjectivity, which is where you and I both have a subjective assessment, right? We both look at our phone and we see it a particular color. I see it as black, you see it as black. We pull some random guy from the street, he sees it as black. We pull people from different demographics, different religious beliefs, different communities, different ethnic backgrounds. They speak different languages. They're of a different age. They have a different level of education, etc., etc. You really try to broaden your population in terms of their demographic variability. And if they all report that the thing is black, then we can say that that's good enough. And that's sort of a pragmatic, and I mean this philosophically, philosophical pragmatism, American pragmatism. It's a pragmatic way to get at something called intersubjectivity, and that's kind of objective but kind of not, because, for example, if we start to scale those things at the species level, there may be some things that are true intersubjectively when you're looking at human beings, because we are the same biological species. But if I was to pull in a different, let's say one of our close relatives, orangutans or chimpanzees or whatnot, there may be some variability there because they see things through a chimpanzee lens or an orangutan lens, whereas we see things through a human lens. And that is true even further down the phylogenetic chain. So you can imagine there's going to be some perceptual commonality between human beings and chimpanzees because we're close phylogenetically. You can imagine that's going to be true of great apes in general. Great apes include chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas, and human beings. But you can imagine as you go further down the phylogenetic chain, you start to get into, let's say, monkeys, broadly speaking. There'll be more variation in our perceptions, and so fewer things are going to be intersubjectively true. You can imagine you expand it even further. Let's say you start looking at aquatic mammals who are further, more distantly related than chimpanzees to us. Same principle would hold. And that's interesting because, I remember watching, I can't remember what it was called. I think it was Star Trek. One of the Star Treks. One of the more recent Star Treks, with that young lady who was also on a really good zombie movie that I like. Not movie series. Gosh, I can't remember. At any rate, the young lady in that Star Trek movie, her character was a xenoanthropologist, which was sort of an anthropologist who studied non-human persons, I'm guessing, aliens. You can imagine that this principle that I've just discussed of intersubjectivity extends beyond just life.